appreciate you being here. I've known Scott Snow for 45 years. I'm not going to do a long bio on Scott because you can read that in your newsletter, and I probably already have, and you've seen his work. He's, suffice it to say, he's a superb artist. He's had an outstanding career in illustration and fine art, and including this piece. This is his, I think, a great piece about Captain Moroni, Book of Mormon leader, that Scott did, and this was published in last August's church magazine called Lehona. And he has just renowned in his artwork, and you've seen his examples and things he's done here. What I'm going to tell you, though, is a little scene setter about his work in broadcast journalism. Broadcast journalism really was primarily born and became a mainstay of American households during the Second World War. When Bill Paley, then head of his young and growing CBS, or Columbia Broadcasting System network, he hired a bunch of young people to start doing some news. And in 1937, he sent Edward R. Murrow to London to help cover what was going on and what Hitler was doing in the beginning of the war. Murrow assembled his Murrow boys, as they became known, people like Robert Trout and Charles Collingwood, and William Shire, Eric Severide. They covered the war. In fact, Bob Trout had to teach Edward R. Murrow how to use a microphone. But then Murrow became famous during the war, broadcasting during the Blitzkrieg from the rooftops of London with his famous line, "London is burning." Well, after the war, television began to emerge more dominantly in the broadcast journalism business, and by 1950, Douglas Edwards was anchoring a CBS 15-minute coast-to-coast newscast for CBS. In 1962, the broadcast was expanded to 30 minutes, and a former UPI war correspondent by the name of Walter Cronkite was given the job to anchor the new 30-minute CBS Evening News. Doug Edwards remained with CBS until 1981, and then he passed away in about 2013. He never left. By the time I joined CBS News, which was in 1978, Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. That's where television news had grown to and what it was back then. 60 Minutes had been born, and more than 62% of the American public every night watched a network newscast. Walter Cronkite, or Huntley Brinkley, or Frank Reynolds, later Harry Reasoner, and the whole list goes on and on. Today, about 15% of the American public watches a network evening newscast. People don't watch television, especially television news, and certainly our young people. They think they're getting their news from the internet. That's gossip, not news. It's not invented in any way, but it was very, very much a popular part and an important part of the American life back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, until it started to fade. Well, KSL television rose to prominence in 1965 when Arch Madsen, who was then the president of Bonneville International, who that company had been created out of KSL. Arch Madsen came from Washington back home to run and create Bonneville. And he brought a couple of men across the street from KTVX by the name of Bob Welty and Paul James. And they paired him up with Dick Norse, and KSL Television News never looked back in terms of leadership. And when I took over the news operation in 1972, KSL dominated the 6 and 10 o'clock newscasts. And there was one time in the early 1980s, which is where we're getting to, that KSL News at 6 o'clock was the most highly rated local newscast in America. Well, but there was still one thing in 1980 and 81 that we could not do. We could not use a camera and show pictures of a courtroom or any legal proceeding. cameras weren't allowed. Well, television without a picture isn't television, that's radio. And so we had to do something. And so we hired sketch artists to draw pictures of what was going on in a courtroom. In 1980, there was a major trial here of a racist who had committed a couple of murders, shot two joggers who were jogging near Liberty Park, two black men. They were jogging with white girls. And this racist, Joseph Paul Franklin, shot the two of them and killed them. He was tried here, later went on, was tried for another murder in Missouri and was executed in Missouri. But in 1980, our artist had left KSL, and this trial was coming up for Joseph Paul Franklin, and we were desperate. And that's when Scott Snow walked into my office. A friend had recommended him, he came in. We needed an artist. I said, sit down and draw a picture of that reporter over there and see how fast you can do it. He did, and I hired him on the spot. The next day, we sent him to the Joseph Paul Franklin trial to do our coverage for that. That was in 1981. This murder had taken place in August of 1980. Well, Scott's sketches turned into pastel chalk drawings with more realistic pictures, faster and better than anything I had seen or have since. To me, my friends, Scott Snow set the standard for and is still the highest standard of courtroom art done today, because we still can't get cameras in some courts. So we depend on people like him, and there's no one better. Scott Snow.
Thank you. Let me take a picture of this. Thank you, Spence. Okay. Thanks. Well, thank you, Spence, for that nice introduction. I do remember that day of my audition. It was rather nerve-wracking, to say the least. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank my other guests for coming, especially Noel. I want to thank you for traveling from Price. Now, I met Noel at Utah State. We were both students of Glenn Edwards up there. I met him and chatted about my courtroom art, and lo and behold, 3 or so years later, he had a show, arranged for a show of my courtroom art, of which some of them are here tonight in those frames, at Utah State University Price about 2 years ago. And I appreciated them. I appreciate you being here now. So I want to thank you all, the Westerners, for inviting me to speak tonight. I hope that what I prepared will be meaningful and interesting to you. I believe it will be. We're going to walk together down memory lane and remember what happened in the state of Utah and in the West, per se, the last 40 years in terms of infamous criminals, infamous trials. So to begin, I've been asked to share my experience as a courtroom artist, and the best way I know how to do that is to do it through my art, through my sketches, as they depict the history of my experience. For 40 years, I sat in court with my colored paper and pastels in hand, witnessing history unfold in real time. And as a courtroom artist, I was both an observer and a storyteller, capturing the drama, the tension, and the humanity of the trials that shaped the legal and social landscape of the West. My court art served as the public's eye in moments where cameras were not allowed, as Spence mentioned, they preserving not only the faces and the gestures, but also the essence of justice in action. Tonight, I will take you through a few pivotal cases that I documented, the historical moments that I witnessed, and the evolving role of courtroom art in preserving our shared history. Together, we have the opportunity to reflect on some of the West's most notorious criminals. Unfortunately, we're going to learn about some bad people tonight, be reminded of them, and the important trials that rocked our community. Through my sketches, we will revisit the circumstances, surroundings of these cases, preserving not only their faces, but also the broader social and historical context in which these trials unfolded. That was a picture of Joseph Paul Franklin, and one day he wore a shirt that said, "Jewism is fascism," whatever that meant. So let's begin with a brief overview of some of the more significant trials I covered, following them in chronological order, beginning in 1981 when I started for KSL in the Franklin trial. And we're going to have somewhat of a police lineup tonight, if you will, the most notorious criminals and infamous cases. Joseph Paul Franklin, as Spence mentioned, a white supremacist and a serial killer. He carried out a nationwide killing spree from 1977 to 1980, targeting black, Jewish, and interracial victims in an attempt to incite a race war. In Salt Lake City, he shot and killed 2 black men. Ted Fields and David Martin, as they jogged with white friends in Liberty Park. Who can forget the shock and the horror that we all felt in our community over this horrible deed? Now in court, Franklin was full of ego, insisting on representing himself, relishing the opportunity to control the narrative, even questioning his ex-wife on the stand to manipulate testimony in his favor. His trial included such surprises as propaganda written on the back of his shirt and an attempted escape from the courthouse during his trial. I'll mention more on this in a moment. Franklin was convicted of multiple murders and executed by lethal injection in Missouri in 2013. Francis and Mark Schroeder. In 1978, New York socialite Frances Bernice Schroeder coerced her 17-year-old son Mark into murdering her father, auto parts millionaire Franklin Bradshaw, to secure her inheritance. Their cases were handled separately, with Frances benefiting from a team of high-powered attorneys that her wealth could afford. While prosecutors worked to uncover the truth, her defense fought hard to control the narrative and to keep certain details obscure. Witnesses included a would-be hitman, a gun dealer, and character witnesses familiar with Frances's life in New York socialite circles. Mark ended up testifying against his mother at her trial. Then, in his trial, as Mark's defense presentation started, his defense team shocked the court with a written statement that said, in fact, I had killed my grandfather. His mother coerced him. Here he is at the moment that that statement was read in court, head down and in tears. Another shocking aspect to this story is the unwavering support of Widow Bradshaw for Frances. And during the trial, she was there every day. She even at one point testified on Frances's behalf, which is bizarre to think about. She later even bequeathed half of her estate to Frances after her passing. Now, Frances was convicted of first-degree murder for orchestrating the killing and served 13 years before dying in prison in 2004. Mark, who carried out the murder at mother's request, to borrow the phrase from the popular tell-all book, was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 12 years in prison before being released in 1994. And he has continued to maintain that he was manipulated by his mother and expressed remorse for his actions. The Downwinders trial, does anyone remember that? Now, this is the only trial on my list that's a civil case, though you could say here that the government was the criminal. In 1982, the Downwinders trial was a landmark federal case in which citizens of southern Utah sued the U.S. government over exposure to radioactive fallout from nuclear testing at the Nevada test site. Heard in Judge David Jenkins' federal court, he's one of my all-time favorite judges, and And I would say this about the federal judges. I've been in plenty of their courts, and I've always been impressed with them. Every one of those judges are amazing. David Jenkins' court, where this proceeding lasted 13 weeks, had 90 witnesses testify and 24 individual claims. I was lucky enough to be just down the street, and so every other day KSL called and I could just walk to the courthouse, draw some great, interesting people, and then come back, and that lasted for 13 weeks. It was a good paycheck, Spence. So as an artist, I was particularly pleased with the array of interesting characters that I was able to capture, including these two. These are the Bullock brothers, ranchers, local ranchers in southern Utah, who lost 4,000 sheep for the nuclear test. Now, they had sued the government in 1956 and lost, but they were resuing them for some other points of law, along with the nuclear trial that was happening in 1982. And so I drew these characters. They were just in the gallery, and I turned from the witness because they looked more interesting. I was pleased with the array of interesting people, and they included some of these older gentlemen that were all either scientists, government officials, or people that were involved in the testing at the time. And it was really a great experience for an artist to have such great models. One moment engraved in my memory occurred when a woman was wheeled into the court, her fiery red hair stark against the pale greenish tint of her skin on her face. She had gone with her 5th grade class on a field trip to watch the nuclear explosion. The sight of her so visibly altered by the effects of the tests was a stark reminder of the lasting harm caused by those exposed in those populated areas. After years of legal battles, some victims received compensation, though many felt it was too little too late. Arthur Gary Bishop. Bishop was a child molester and a serial killer who between 1979 and 1983 abducted and murdered 5 young boys in Salt Lake City. His trial was a haunting spectacle. In a particularly poignant moment, the younger brother of one of the victims took the stand to identify Bishop, providing a first-hand account that deeply impacted all present. In a packed courtroom, Bishop sat expressionless as prosecutors laid out his horrific crimes. His confession to police during his arrest sealed his fate. During the penalty phase of the trial, one of the most emotional moments I have ever witnessed in court was the testimony of a grieving mother fighting back tears and clutching a handkerchief. She stood before the court and spoke of her unimaginable loss. Her brief moment on the stand was a simple yet devastating moment. In that time, the weight of his crimes was laid bare through the sorrow and tears of a mother who would never see her child again. Convicted of multiple counts of murder, Bishop was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 1988. Ron and Dan Lafferty. In 1984, brothers Dan and Ron Lafferty murdered their sister-in-law, Brenda Lafferty, and her 15-month-old daughter, Erica, in American Fork, claiming that they were acting on divine revelation. Each were charged in a separate criminal proceeding. This courtroom-wide depicts Dan Lafferty's trial. Dan had the arrogance, along with Franklin, and attempted to represent himself as well. I believe he fashioned himself as a modern-day prophet and purposefully dressed the part with long hair, beard, and a suit vest. Dan's trial ended in a hung jury. It was widely suggested that a female juror had become infatuated with him, potentially influencing her vote. The case was retried, ultimately ending in a conviction. Dan received a life sentence without parole and is currently still imprisoned. Now, at Ron Lafferty's trial, he appeared disoriented and out of place, frequently consulting with his attorney. His plaid flannel shirts gave the impression of a man more suited to farm life than a murder trial. And like his brother, Ron seemed uncertain as to why he was even there. Ron also was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, but died of natural causes in 2019. Mark Hofmann, who some in this audience know all too well, was a skilled forger who created counterfeit historical documents, including items related to Latter-day Saint history. His forgeries were so convincing that they deceived even the experts. However, in 1985, as his fraudulent activities began to unravel, and for financial reasons, Hofmann, in an attempt to divert attention, resorted to the murders of collector Stephen Christensen and Kathy Sheets with homemade bombs. A third bomb, meant to further cover his tracks, injured Hofmann himself. Mark was identified early on as the principal suspect, yet the case against him was largely circumstantial. At his initial arraignment, Mark Hofmann appeared on crutches due to the injuries from the car bomb that he had orchestrated. Later, he sat motionless in a wheelchair as the prosecution presented compelling evidence, including the discovery of forgery materials in Hofmann's basement and expert analysis confirming the fraudulent nature of his documents. At trial, a young neighbor boy of victim Kathy Sheets said that he saw a van and a man matching Hofmann's general description driving away. It was unusual to draw young people like that, and he was a witness in the court. Prosecutors produced voluminous evidence of his forgeries, debts, and connection to the bomb. So faced with mounting pressure, Hofmann struck a plea deal, agreeing to reveal the full extent of his crimes, much to the dismay of his family, who was convinced of his innocence and had stood by him through the whole ordeal. So Hofmann was sentenced to life in prison, where he remains to this day an enigma of evil, murder, and deception, who fooled religious leaders, scholars, and collectors alike. The Singer-Swapp FBI standoff occurred in 1988 in Marion, Utah, when the Singer family and their associates, including Adam Swapp, engaged in a 13-day armed standoff with federal agents after Swapp had bombed a local LDS church. I think I remember that they followed his footsteps up to his cabin from the chapel. Yeah, so he wasn't too smart after all. It ended with the tragic shooting death of Officer Fred House, which the center out here at the point of the mountain is named for, and the arrest of Swapp and several others. At the arraignment, Adam Swapp appeared in court wearing bandages on his forearm from the injuries he sustained at the shootout. Timothy Singer, who shot Officer House, was wheeled into the arraignment in a wheelchair. Matriarch Vicky Singer, brothers Jonathan Swapp, and Adam's two wives, Charlotte and Heidi, were also arraigned. The trial lasted several weeks, with key moments including FBI agents standing in front of a door riddled with bullet holes, and a display table with all the many weapons confiscated at the cabin after the siege. A key moment came when an FBI agent took the stand wearing the same bulletproof vest and jacket from that day. As he opened his jacket, he revealed a bullet hole, clear evidence of the round that struck him, stopped only by the vest that saved his life. Adam Swapp was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison, yet he was released on parole in 2018 after serving 20 years. Now, Timothy Singer and Jonathan Swapp served 10 years each. They're all out on parole today. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber because he carried out a nationwide mail bombing terror campaign between 1978 and 1995, nearly 17 years, spreading fear across the United States as he targeted academics, scientists, and business executives, killing 3 people and injuring 23. He was captured in his Montana cabin in 1996 after his manifesto led to his identification. I think it was his brother that tipped him off. I flew up to Helena in a hurried manner, I actually left my family in a ski cabin in Brighton because they called and said, you got to go. So I had to go for that hurried arraignment the next morning where he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and multiple other crimes. It was difficult to reconcile the man before the court to me, somebody responsible for all those years of fear and terror, when the person I saw appeared as calm and composed and unremarkable as a school janitor. Ted avoided the death penalty by accepting a plea bargain and was sentenced to life in prison without parole, dying by suicide in 2023. Elizabeth Smart and the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping. In 2002, Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl, was kidnapped from her home in Salt Lake City by Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, who held her captive for 9 months. The trial gained international attention. Mitchell attempted to avoid trial each day by singing and making incoherent statements as he was led into the courtroom. The judge quickly removed him, and he watched the trial remotely. This happened about every day. Smart's family was a constant presence in the courtroom, their faces reflecting the pain and the relief as they sat in the gallery intently listening. These sketches capture not just their unwavering focus, but also the tension and the emotion of having to relive the ordeal. Elizabeth took the stand, delivering powerful testimony about her captivity. A striking moment came when she commented on an image behind her showing her walking in the white robes alongside Mitchell and Barzee, a chilling reminder of their control over her. Elizabeth smiled as the verdict was read. Mitchell was convicted of kidnapping and sexual assault, and Wanda Barzee received a lesser sentence. During the penalty phase of the trial, she had the chance to stand before Mitchell and tell him what he did was wrong. She said, quote, "I have a wonderful life, and no matter what you do, you will never affect me again," which I think is a marvelous comment on her inner strength. The aftermath led to greater awareness of child abductions, with Smart becoming an advocate for missing persons and victims of abduction. Now, after reviewing our list of infamous people, which isn't that tiring to go through that emotionally? I'd like to shift my focus now to the beginnings of my journey. Some of it's been already mentioned. As a courtroom artist, how I got started and the process behind my work, and some of the personal experiences and impressions that I've had of some of the trials. While there simply isn't enough time to cover everything, I've selected a few key moments and stories that offer a glimpse into the unique and often unpredictable world of courtroom illustration. This portion of my presentation, I'll focus more on overarching themes rather than a strict chronological order, so I might jump around a little bit as they relate to key topics. So let's start with my audition to become a courtroom artist, which is, I'm going to tell you my side of it now. So I never set out to be a courtroom artist. It wasn't premeditated. Okay, did you get that? Premeditated? Okay, that went right over your head. But even as a kid, I was fascinated with courtroom art when I saw it on the news, especially the courtroom art of the great Howard Brody, who would draw in the Supreme Court. And he's drawn many, many famous trials. I actually had the opportunity to draw beside him in 1982, and that was a real honor of mine because I really looked up to him for the Downwinders trial. But after graduating from Utah State, I was focused on building my business when KSL's art director called, and he'd asked if I've ever done any courtroom art, and I said, no, I don't think so, but I'd be willing to try. And so he invited me to bring my drawing materials to the station. So I kind of guessed that this was going to be an audition. So I kind of knew what was going on. So after sketching the news reporter at his desk, and I remember Spence telling the reporter, he said, don't bother posing for this guy because nobody in court ever poses for anybody. Just go about your work, and I want to see if he can capture you. And so he came back 20 minutes later and said, I think that looks enough like him. And that was it. I was hired. So
We were desperate.
We were desperate. This is the side story. The true part is that Mike Lee had been a courtroom artist, but he's also an art director at KSL. He'd do a lot of other things, but whenever they needed an artist to go into court, he was there because he was their employee. He had moved to California and they'd forgot all about that until the day before the trial, and then they called me. So that's how I got hooked up. So the next day I was in the Franklin trial. At first I was stiff and tentative. It took about 3 months for me to really loosen up. Take a look at this very first courtroom sketch of mine. It shows very clearly that I didn't yet know what I was doing, and I didn't know how to distort perspectives for the TV format and be more dynamic. Now, you know, the proportions are fatally accurate, but yet I was trying to work with clumsy chalks. I have my chalks and my pastels in the back when you would look at them, but they're the size of your finger. And I'm trying to draw 2-inch heads with a 1-inch head with a clumsy chalk. It just wasn't working. It's a wonder that KSL stuck with me, frankly, from that first few weeks. Now compare that to the wide courtroom scene from years later. The difference is striking. More confident strokes, refined composition, and a tighter, more dynamic perspective. The difference is clear, obvious. As time went on, my confidence grew, and by the time I got to the Downwinders trial, a year after the Franklin trial, I'd found my rhythm, focusing on the fundamentals of drawing and even starting to enjoy myself. Now let's take a look at some of my methods. At the time, most courtroom artists were in Utah, and I think throughout the country, were drawing with colored pencils in white sketch pads. So their sketches were on white paper. And I took a different approach right from the beginning, mostly because of my experiences with Glenn at Utah State. I took some large paper, colored paper, because I thought, this is color TV. I'm going to grab some colored paper instead of white paper. Why not? It's a no-brainer. And use larger paper or larger format and do colored pastels. So this not only gave my drawings more depth and accuracy, but also worked better for the color television, as I mentioned. Since the white paper, if you had an old screen, it would vibrate when you had to display. So before long, my method became the standard in Utah, and I think throughout the country. Here's a picture of me drawing in court at the Franklin trial. You can see the large clipboard in my lap with my pastels resting on a towel and also on my lap. Con Saris, KSL's reporter at that time, had already given me my work list, and you can see from the notepad there, I'm following my chop list because I had probably 3 or 4 drawings to do that day. You may wonder why artists are in the courtroom. Spence touched on it, instead of cameras. Courtroom access rules vary. Some states do allow court cameras in the courtroom, but federal courts prohibit them, citing concerns about potential impact of witnesses, jurors, and the integrity of the proceedings. Since the late 1980s, when pool photography was introduced in Utah courts, most of my work has been in federal court, where sketches remain the only visual record. Now, as a side note, when cameras were first introduced, I'm looking at you, Spence, more than one person told me, honestly, I think it's boring. I like your drawings better. They're more dramatic. Now, I'm not sure if they were just being polite, but I have to admit that I felt somewhat the same, and of course you know that I'm biased. Now, every courtroom sketch you see tonight was created entirely in the courtroom. Nothing reworked afterwards. Some were rushed and it shows, and others I had the luxury of working on it an hour or more. A few of them were never finished, and some of them were finished to my satisfaction. I felt really good about. Now, I wasn't in court every day. Instead, I was called in on an as-needed basis, typically when a particularly significant or dramatic day was expected. In that sense, I was like a doctor on call. It felt like high-stakes poker. The pressure was immense, knowing that whatever I sketched that day would be on the 6 o'clock news that night. At the start of most trials, my primary focus was on capturing the key moments of the courtroom, most often set by the priorities of the reporter that I was working with, which usually included a wide scene of the courtroom, defendant or defendants, attorneys often at the podium, the judge, and then any significant witnesses. Now, depending on the case, sometimes I was asked to do the jury. More often than not, I was working on multiple drawings at the same time. Now, you may have noticed that at times I was asked to create artist depictions. You've seen a couple of them already. A scene based on testimony or news events pieced together from an available information, and the interpretation is, to be expounded upon. Let me show you some. Here's a drawing of the kidnapping of John Huntsman's son James in 1987. Do any of you remember this case? Okay, so he was kidnapped, and the police traced the call to the payphone of the Safeway on Third West. Yeah. One can safely assume that I was not standing on the corner drawing this as it took place. Here's a depiction of Arthur Gary Bishop's jury deliberating his fate, which caused quite a stir. The judge saw it on TV and had his clerk call the station and ask how the artist had gotten into the jury room. The truth, I knew the jury foreman. He was a neighbor. But I had drawn him and the others so convincingly, it was enough to make the judge wonder if somehow I had slipped into the jury room. Here's a depiction of Joseph Paul Franklin in the field across from Liberty Park, rifle in hand. And this illustrates the view and the testimony of a witness who looked out his window and saw this and was testifying in court. So these enhanced depictions were used to embellish, or actually say illustrate some of the aspects of the information that was gathered.
Like the Hofmann car.
Yeah, like the Hofmann car. Other examples include a featured news story on the lone survivor's account of the Wilburg mine disaster. There's one person that survived. In 1984, a devastating fire broke out deep in the mine, trapping the miners. Thick smoke and intense heat made escape impossible for most, as rescuers struggled for hours to reach them. These drawings depict the harrowing ordeal of lone survivor Joe Main and his frantic but ultimately successful fight to stay alive. 27 miners perished, their families left to grapple with the unimaginable loss. In the years since, Main has become a dedicated advocate for mine safety reforms, working to prevent future tragedies like Wilburg Mine. This last example takes us back to Franklin and his attempted escape during the trial. Left alone in the holding area during a break, he managed to open the elevator doors by tampering with the wiring and go down a floor where the elevator doors would not open for him. When he was discovered missing, everyone was asked to leave the courtroom. While authorities searched for him, it was a tense moment by everyone. They all felt concerned for their own personal safety. I remember looking out at the fourth-story windows down onto the square, watching police officers scour the block, checking in trash bins, peering behind bushes. And Franklin's escape was foiled when he became stuck in the elevator, leading to his recapture shortly thereafter. Court resumed with a sigh of relief. Now, with the remaining time I have, I'd like to share a few more memories with you as a courtroom artist and my personal impressions of certain cases. Throughout my career, I prided myself on maintaining objectivity, striving to capture exactly what I witnessed in the courtroom. My focus was always on portraying accurate likenesses and faithfully representing the events. However, I must admit that there was one instance where I chose to subtly editorialize. It occurred during the trial of Dan Lafferty. The evidence and the horrific nature of the crimes committed by him were so deeply unsettling that I decided to color Lafferty's finger red, a subtle but deliberate gesture meant to symbolize his guilt. I don't know if anybody picked up on it but me, but I felt really good about it. Lafferty, much like Franklin, was consumed by his ego and self-importance, but both men, after insisting to represent themselves in court, in the end they still it couldn't shield either of them from justice. And I remember the Unabomber arraignment, because of his unexpected capture, I had to rush up to the airport to be there in the morning. I arrived an hour early because I had been told proceedings would be brief. I was able to finish 4 competent drawings, which I was amazed because I started them before he even entered the courtroom. I had most of the background done, so because I had to work real fast. I think the whole arraignment lasted an hour, and I ended up with 4 drawings. I mentioned that he was hard to figure out. He was pretty quiet, and since I don't think he was just like an unassuming, an unremarkable person. In many ways, it was a shock that he had done so much and hurt so many. I also mentioned that I usually sat behind the bar, as the picture showed me earlier, where I would sit with the gallery, and I have to arrive early because I was sitting where the public was sitting, and if I didn't get there early, I couldn't get a good seat. So I'd either, try and get on the front row just behind the bar, either left or right, so I had an angle that I could draw from, to make it worthwhile. But on occasion, I was permitted to sit in the jury seats if the trial was being decided by a judge. So for the Blackwater Guard arraignment here in Salt Lake in 2008, I was smart enough to contact the clerk the day before for permission to sit in the jury seats. And while all the other artists from all the other news agencies were behind the bar with just a back view of these 4 accused, I had the front row seat and was able to capture this scene here, which I'm particularly proud of. I had about an hour and a half or 2 to do it. But I think I captured the likenesses of every one of those people, whereas everybody else just got the backs of their heads. So I got a competitive edge that day. On occasion, I had the opportunity to capture well-known figures in the courtroom, and this is a 2011 appearance of Bill Gates, who testified in the Novell versus Microsoft case in federal court here in Salt Lake City. Here, Bill Gates answers questions on the witness stand with his laptop open in front of him and his screen projected behind him. Gates' testimony aimed to defend Microsoft, arguing the company's actions were within bounds, normal bounds of business practices. Now, this screen is intentionally left blank because I don't have a drawing to show you here. Are you ready for a sad story? Drawing in the Supreme Court was always a dream of mine, and one day I received a call from CBS and said they couldn't locate their local artist, and would I come to Washington to draw the Supreme Court? I was elated. I could not sleep that night. The next day, I was at the airport early, ticket in hand, when I heard my name called over the pager to go to the white phones. It was bad news. CBS had found their artist, and I was off the case. They did offer to pay me for that day as if I'd gone, but it was little consolation, and so I wore black for the rest of the week, just like the screen. Now, one could argue that the outcome of most trials are fairly obvious. There were, however, a few trials I covered where the defendant or defendants were found innocent. 2 come to mind. The first, the Salt Lake Olympic bribery trial, which rocked our community the year after a very successful games was held in Salt Lake. It was in Judge David Sam's court. The government claimed that bid leaders Tom Welsh and David Johnson had bribed International Olympic Committee members to secure the games, gaining national attention. After days of testimony, the prosecution rested its case, and in a rare move, Judge Sam immediately dismissed all charges, even before the defense had to put their presentation up on the stand. In a sharp rebuke, he condemned the government for pursuing the case, calling it a waste of taxpayers' money, and criticized prosecutors for bringing it into his court. His words were direct and forceful, leaving no doubt of his views on the case's merits. Now, as a side note, I sat sketching Judge Sam in his courtroom, and I kept thinking to myself, his voice, it sounds so oddly familiar. It took me a while to place it, but then it clicked. He had the exact same measured cadence and sound, and he sounded just like comedian Bob Newhart. And in the end, it was the prosecutors who found themselves on the receiving end of his punchline. The second trial, where the defendant was found not guilty, involved accused spy Wen-Ho Lee. The case took place in Albuquerque. You may remember the intense media coverage surrounding this. I spent the day drawing Wen-Ho Lee and his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 9 months. And that added to the complexity of the public's perception of the case. The government was unable to prove their case, so charges were finally dropped. Lee went on to sue the federal government and was awarded a significant settlement, millions, for his privacy violations, as well as gaining the apology of President Clinton. So a surprising moment in this case happened after I stepped out of the courtroom after the trial was over. And I was approached by I was working for NBC, or for KSL, which was NBC at the time. I was approached by a CBS reporter asking me if I could let them use my drawings. Apparently their artist had bombed. So, network competition as it is, I laughed and I said, I doubt it, because I was working for NBC. But I said, I'll check with my people if you check with yours. So to my surprise, the request made it all the way up the chain to the network's headquarters in New York. They struck a deal. So that night, my drawings appeared on both CBS and NBC, a collaboration practically unheard of in the news business, and you can attest to that. When sketching a wide courtroom scene or a judge, I always enjoyed including the American flag or the court seal behind them. It seemed to reinforce the principles of equal justice under the law, a promise enshrined in our Constitution. And throughout my years in the courtroom, I've gained a deep respect for juries and the vital role they play in our justice system. A jury of our peers is the bedrock of our democracy, ensuring that justice is not decided by a single authority, but by a cross-section of our community. From my perspective, they usually got it right, although I wasn't in the courtroom every day. Perhaps like you, I would often form an opinion. In some cases, the verdict seemed undeniable. On a lighter note, Bob Stott, depicted here, an attorney for Salt Lake City, a veteran prosecutor who handled cases like Franklin, Hofmann, Gardner, and Bishop, and who became a friend of mine, had his own take on juries and a great sense of humor. That's Bob. After his retirement, he commissioned me to do this drawing for him. I guess he wanted to make his own personal statement about juries and the characters he encountered. It also share a good laugh. So in conclusion, it's my assertion that courtroom art serves as an invaluable historical record. My work has been showcased in numerous exhibitions, and I have retained a significant portion of my drawings, which chronicle moments that can never be recreated. Alongside this, I have preserved many of the television news reports, and though some are old dated VHSs, they still provide an important context. 2 examples.
Deliberately hid reports that radiation from fallout contributed to some 4,000 sheep deaths in Utah in the early 50s is over. Southern Utah sheepmen, in seeking to reopen a 1956 trial, say the old Atomic Energy Commission and government attorneys fraudulently withheld key information during that earlier trial. Judge Sherman Christensen now is considering the testimony. He says he'll rule on whether fraud was indeed committed.
The biggest issue for the jurors is the credibility of the witnesses, since there is very little physical evidence. The government's key witnesses all changed their story several times, so the jury must decide if their testimony at this trial was the truthful version. In closing arguments, Prosecutor David Schwindeman asked the jury to use its common sense in deciding if Benton Badani, Thomas Clay, and Ben Atteen are guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecutor said these men committed the most serious crime you can commit. They took the life of another. He asked the jury to do justice for the victims and the victims' families.
So I have hours and hours of recorded video just like that. and I'd like to someday check again with KSL to see what they have. So my goal now is to find a proper repository that will catalog and preserve not only the art I would like to donate somewhere, but also the accompanying videos, ensuring that these pieces are kept accessible for future generations. Over the course of my 40 years of courtroom drawing, I have developed a deep appreciation for the greatest judicial system in the world, one that upholds the rights of the accused, guarantees a jury of one's peers, and enshrines the principles of innocent until proven guilty. We must continue to honor and protect it. And with that, I rest my case. And yes, I'll take questions if you have any. Okay. Yes, Spence.
You mentioned it briefly. Explain how you worked with the reporters assigned to these stories. Not always was there a reporter there, but when there was, how did you work with them? We didn't need to send them. You did a great job without them.
Well, they did need to record because, I mean, I was doing my drawings. They needed to record what was going on, and so that's what they did. They were taking notes the whole time. So they could go back, edit my drawings, and then tell the story as they did.
Did they give you any instructions?
Yeah, they did. Usually the priority was who was the witness on the stand because they sometimes were there only 10, 20 minutes. You know, depending on the important aspects of a witness, they could be on for an hour, but for the most part, they were quick. And so the usual exchange of information included who was going to be on the stand about what time and to expect to just stop whatever else I was doing and draw them. Because again, I was working on wide courtroom scenes and the judge and maybe the jury, and then a witness would come on and I'd have to stop all those and go and do that. So I was constantly talking to the reporters, and it did help. Yes, Elaine.
Talk about the editorial process. You just mentioned the reporter might be giving you some feedback. I wonder when you get back to the newsroom, like, had an editor seen your red finger of guilt?
I don't think any.
We didn't see it.
Engaged in that.
I don't think anybody picked up on that finger but me, and I was satisfied with doing it. It made me feel real good. But Elaine, to your question, I was always impressed with what ended up on the news and how the reporter sounding through the story and the cameraman filming my artwork would move across the artwork as if they were in the courtroom themselves and then cut to the witness and then cut back to the judge and stuff. And that editorial art is amazing. And I always respected that. And I told them so. I said, I thought that your work was magnificent. Sometimes I take my drawings right out of the courtroom and they would tape them on the side of their truck and film and immediately send the story to the station, and they would be edited there because there just wasn't time. I mean, court would get out at 4:30, sometimes 5 o'clock, and they had to have it ready by 6. So it was really, really rushed.
I think we're using two different terms. You're talking about production, and I'm talking about, like, editorial oversight.
Explain what you mean, because I mean, I tried to depict what was happening without any prejudice. That was what I did, and the news.
So, like, if the reporter was sitting there and said, "Oh, you didn't capture X," like, might you get that kind of feedback?
Yeah, back and forth, but I mean, I never not satisfied the reporter. What I mean to say is that whatever he told me to do, I did. You know, and I was working on drawings that I never finished because they had other priorities. So I had to address their needs, and I just assumed they knew what they were doing, and I was fine with that because I was working for them. Yeah, Scott.
Just one really dumb question. In terms of copyright, do you own the work? Does KSL own it?
I own the copyright, I think. I've extended to them the video right to show it, and they could show it as an archive. They still have that right. They have the right to be able to do it, but it's my artwork and I retain it. I kept all my artwork. Sadly to say, it took me a long time to go through my court drawings to decide what to show you tonight. I have stacks and stacks of originals, hundreds of drawings. And now I've sold a lot of them. When I say a lot, you know, if an attorney liked the way I presented him, or they wanted to show their importance, they'd come to my office and I would sell them the drawings, and I sold, lots that way. So I don't have everything, but I kept the copyrights. And I don't know if I hopefully made it clear, but I'm getting older, and I want to see these in a library somewhere, and I want to see some of the video that I've kept, plus really go to the stations and see what they have archived and put it together as a package, and trying to preserve them, because, if you look at the stuff on the back table there, they're just tissued, and they're pastels. You could walk that back there today and rub a finger right through a face, and it would just ruin it. So anyway, so that's kind of my overall goal. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Luba.
Got emotional talking about some of the stories, and I'm sure that a lot of the cases that you were witnessing were intense. Did emotion ever overcome you to the point where you couldn't draw what you were witnessing and seeing?
You said that, did it overcome me, the emotions of the trial?
Yeah.
Yes, it did. I had to step out a couple of times. This Lafferty thing really bothered me. The death of a baby, that was horrendous. And I'd had it at that point. So, yeah. But at the same time, normally, in my cases, I've said this before, but when there's, more like the downwinders or other trials, I'd go to court and I'd come back and I'd watch the news and I'd say, oh, is that what happened today? Because I was so focused on my drawings. For the most part, I was really focused on them. That's why the reporters had to be there, Spence, because that's what I was mostly focused on. There was another trial that really bothered me. I thought to maybe show it tonight, and I didn't, but about the same time as the Lafferty trial, and it was tried by the same Walsh, I think, the prosecutor down there. There was a child molestation case in Lehigh, and I forget the name of the defendant, but he was found guilty. And that had an array of people, including, I think there was a Barbara Ward Snow that was a psychiatrist, and they were worried that she was leading and filling their minds, these young children who testified against their father, with ideas that weren't really true. So that was a big debate there too. But that trial also bothered me. Okay, any other questions? Yes, Charles.
Did you save any of your unfinished work?
Oh yeah, there's one back there. If you look back on the green paper, just flip it over. Yeah, no, yeah. There was plenty of drawings that I never really finished. But you know what, the sad news was, again, it didn't really matter to the news. If I had drawn a witness and it was 3 minutes, by the way, I am really touched and proud of capturing this mother who lost her son in the Bishop trial, because that was the penalty phase of the trial, and her point was the court needed to hear her loss. That was why she was on the stand. She was only there for 6 minutes, and I was able to capture that drawing. That was fast work, but I'm really proud of that because that's one of my favorite drawings. Yeah, but there are plenty that are unfinished. Any other questions? Yeah.
I noticed you didn't have Marie Osmond in there. Did you have that one?
Yeah, well, so I did.
I love that.
I did show Bill Gates, but about the same time as Mark Hofmann, one of the investors that the Osmond family used, an advisor, he was accused of frauding them. And his name was Gary Sheets, and his wife was Kathy Sheets, who was killed by Hoffman. But Gary Sheets was the defendant in a trial that he was accused of fraud. And in one day came Marie and Alan and Merrill and 2 others, and I drew every one of them in court. And I was going to show them today, but I didn't. I thought the drawing of Marie turned out pretty good. It was pretty accurate. But anyway, so thanks, dear. Okay, well, I guess that's it.
Gotta call it a night.
Thank you so much.
That was great.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you very much. Thank you for being here, Spence. Thank you to all the guests. Appreciate your coming. And I'm getting this signed. 3 words.
Let me talk to you.
Badges,
badges and badges. Make sure you drop them off. Did you want to say something?
Nope.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your coming.